In a gathering laced with laughter, elegance, and the sweet scent of perfume, someone released a silent spell of death. A shattered glass bottle, a forgotten scarf, and a fragrance that masked the truth. But the real question is, while everyone was smiling, who among them was quietly choosing their next target? The Mediterranean twilight bled into the sea like ink spilled across glass, as I stepped onto the polished stone steps of Hotel Celestine, nestled among swaying palms and old-world opulence, along the Promenade d'Orly, a place meant for respite, not revelation. March 15, 1937. I'd circled the date in my journal, hoping for silence and solitude under doctor's orders. But the night held other plans. Plans woven in lavender and laced with dread. The first surprise came swift. Poirot, already anchored in the hotel's royal suite, his every gesture as meticulous as ever. Legs crossed just so, fingers toying with the evening salon program, as if deciphering a code. "Mon ami, Hastings," he greeted me, his voice crisp, calculated, and yet oddly expectant. "The Riviera breeze brings you to me, just as the little grey cells predicted. Surely not the weather that lured you here, Poirot?" I asked, my grip firm as we exchanged hands. A smile tugged at his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Ah mais non, Celestine Valrot. She sings tonight, her final aria, her last curtain." The name struck like a bell in memory. Celestine, the siren of Paris, famed for a voice likened to molten silk, wrapped in firelight, capable of breaking hearts or healing souls in a single note. Her abrupt retirement had become a thunderclap in the opera world. Why now, when her legend was still rising? But before the question fully formed, a scream, sharp, agonized and deeply human, sliced through the marbled stillness of the lobby. It was the kind of sound that halts time. Poirot rose in a flash, urgency animating every line of his compact form. I trailed him through corridors laced with tapestries, fresh hydrangeas and antique gas sconces flickering like nervous candles. The sound had come from the Amethyst Chamber, one of the hotel's most exclusive sanctuaries, its entrance now choked with horrified guests, whispering in French, German and hushed English. Pardon, Poirot insisted, using his elbows with surprising precision as he carved a path through the murmuring crowd. Inside, the air turned thick, not with heat, but with perfume. The scent hit me first. Lavender, once soft and elegant, now overpowering, grotesquely sweet, choking the room like gas. And then I saw her, Celestine Valrot, draped like a fallen icon across her vanity, her raven hair obscuring half her face, the other pressed lifelessly against a shattered mirror now fogged by breath that would never come again. Her gown, a masterwork of sapphire silk, clung to her like stage curtains closed too soon. On the obsidian floor lay the remnants of a perfume bottle, glass like ice, scattered in a constellation beneath the chandelier's fractured light. "Mon Dieu," whispered a woman nearby, her pearl necklace trembling with each shallow breath. A pale, stammering hotel attendant stepped back from the body, eyes wide and fingers twitching. "Doctor's on his way." But he stopped. What else could he say? Death had spoken louder. Poirot, eyes narrowed, leaned in with surgical focus. He noted everything: the placement of her hands, the untouched wineglass, the perfectly aligned lipsticks, the strange absence of a stage note or farewell letter. He bent low, sniffing the air like a hound on scent. "Curious, très curieux," he murmured, drawing out his silver-rimmed magnifier. "Hastings, do you see the pattern?" he asked, gesturing toward the broken glass. I followed his gaze, but to me it was chaos, just fragments and shadow. And yet, in Poirot's mind, every shard was a syllable in a silent confession. I felt it then, a creeping chill, not born of cold but something unseen that still lingered in the room. A presence, deliberate and cruel, that had waited until the moment was perfect. Something, or someone, had known that her voice would fall silent tonight, and had ensured it would never rise again. The morning after Celestine Valrot, sudden and sinister death, dawned golden over Hotel Étoile d'Azur, but the warm Mediterranean sun could not burn away the heavy unease that clung to the guests like seamen. In the grand solarium, where marble floors gleamed and gold-trimmed chairs stood like silent sentinels. The guests gathered, not for leisure but for a breakfast steeped in silence and sidelong glances. It was clear to any observer that no one had truly come for the coffee. Rather, each guest in their own carefully controlled posture seemed to be waiting, listening for something news perhaps, or a slip of the tongue from another. Poirot, already immaculate in his dove-grey suit, sat at a corner table with a notebook beside his untouched tea, his expression one of quiet calculation. "They are not mourning," he said softly to me, not looking up. "They are remembering, and more importantly, they are choosing what not to remember." I had not slept well, haunted by the haunting perfume of lavender that had still clung to my collar this morning, unnaturally strong, as though the very scent were trying to confess. Poirot, never one to let emotion cloud deduction, had compiled a list overnight, not just names but connections, an accompanist who arrived too late, a maid whose timing was oddly precise, a manager too quick to call it an accident, and a collection of glittering admirers, who all swore devotion to Celestine, yet showed very different faces in the aftermath of her demise. Our first encounter was with Count Armand Delacroix, a patron of the arts who claimed to have funded Celestine's last concert, but whose trembling hands and overly cheerful facade told another story entirely. Nearby, the Baroness Lazel Hartmann nursed a crystal flute of champagne at 10, her bloodless lips whispering that Celestine had enemies who envied her brilliance, though she herself of course had only ever adored her. A young maid, Marie, was seen clutching a rosary in one hand and a perfume vial in the other, tearfully insisting she'd found the body and no one else had entered. But Poirot's gaze lingered on the faint scratch beneath her sleeve, the sort born not of accident, but of struggle. Then there was the curious Monsieur Doran, Celestine's former vocal coach, now retired and reclusive, who claimed to have heard nothing through the suite's adjoining walls, though his hearing had always been impeccable. Every word spoken that morning carried the scent of performance, as though the salon had merely changed its stage and the tragedy continued, just without music. Inspector Girard arrived eventually, brimming with procedural bluster and pomp, but even he couldn't drown out the tension that had settled like dust in every velvet drape and polished mirror. "An accident," he declared with forced confidence, but Poirot's mustaches twitched with that familiar flicker of disdain. "Non, monsieur," he said quietly, "this was no stumble of fate. Someone rehearsed this final act with precision." As the inspector turned away, Poirot leaned toward me and whispered, "It is not just who would gain from her death we must consider, Hastings, but who needed her voice silenced before the truth could be sung." And with that I understood. The performance had not ended last night. It had only just begun. The velvet morning light spilled through the towering arches of Hotel du Solstice in Nice, gilding the white marble corridors with a deceptive calm. But no amount of sunlight could lift the pall that had settled since the previous night's tragedy. Beneath the surface of polite murmurs and the occasional clink of porcelain teacups, an unspoken dread hung in the air like static before a storm, tension so thick it clung to every velvet curtain and gold-framed painting. Madame Belage, the celebrated soprano whose farewell performance had drawn aristocrats, collectors and musicians from across Europe, was dead, found collapsed at her vanity, her lifeless hand still curled around a silk handkerchief, soaked in lilac perfume. They said it was an unfortunate accident, overexertion perhaps, a fainting spell brought on by nerves, but nothing about the scene felt accidental. The shattered mirror was cracked at eye level, the perfume bottle broken yet not spilled, its scent unnaturally strong, almost suffocating, as if someone had deliberately poured its contents to mask another odor. Standing in the hallway outside her private suite was Monsieur Adrien Duret, a man whose presence alone demanded silence, a former criminologist known in whispered circles for solving cases too twisted for the public eye. Duret had vanished from headlines years ago after a scandal in Vienna that left him haunted but unmatched in perception. He had been invited by the hotel's owner discreetly, a quiet insurance against the scrutiny that would come if the press sniffed out that this was more than a heart attack. Duret moved with slow precision, fingertips grazing doorframes, examining footprints in the carpet, nostrils flaring subtly at the overwhelming scent of lilac that he suspected had been used to cover the bitter trace of a certain sedative. Interviews began quietly, Beneath the gilded ceiling fans of the reading salon, Monsieur Leclerc, the renowned pianist, spoke first. His expression dull, his voice steady. But Duret noted the damp soles of his handmade leather shoes, inconsistent with his claim of retiring early. The Countess Vivienne d'Armand, veiled in jet-black silk and appearing the picture of aristocratic grief, sipped her tea slowly. Yet her trembling fingers betrayed her poise. She admitted visiting Belange the night before to wish her luck, though when pressed she faltered, claiming they spoke of personal concerns that were surely irrelevant now. But Duret caught the glint of lilac powder on her glove, and a single misplaced hairpin found near the mirror, gilded, ornate, and certainly not Belange's, matched those the Countess wore. Then came Delphine Roussel, Belange's understudy, a pale, doe-eyed pianist with calloused fingers and a tremor in her voice that grew when asked about a letter Belange had allegedly intended to deliver the following morning. "It was meant to expose someone," she whispered, "someone powerful in the music world, someone who destroyed careers in the shadows." But no letter was found. The maid Adele said she discovered the body at precisely 9:07 p.m., yet Duret quietly retrieved the hotel's internal call log, showing she had not alerted staff until 9:19, a 12-minute discrepancy she could not explain. Staff gossiped of a man in the hallway just before the scream, someone tall, smoking, face obscured, watching Belange's door, and Duret found a burned matchstick beneath the ornate vase outside her suite. He also discovered something else, faint bruising beneath her right ear, barely visible, consistent with pressure. Not from a fall but a grip. By mid-afternoon the glittering illusion of wealth and glamour had fractured, and what remained was a tapestry of secrets woven tightly into the walls of Hotel du Solstice. The collectors, the aristocrats, the musicians, each had something to hide. Duret stood once again inside Belange's room as sunlight dimmed and shadows stretched long across the marble. He stared into the broken mirror, its spiderweb crack distorting his reflection, and softly murmured, "This was not a death. It was a performance." And like any performance, it left behind a signature. He now believed the killer had orchestrated the scene like a symphony. Every broken bottle, every delayed scream, every rehearsed alibi, part of a macabre composition. But even the most elegant symphony hides a discordant note. Duret just had to find it before the final curtain fell again. The storm had begun its silent prowl over Hotel L'Ombre, as twilight bled across the sky like ink in water, casting long shadows through the grand arched windows of the salon, where laughter had once echoed but now felt jarringly out of place, because Isadora Merle was dead. A woman of spellbinding stagecraft and whispered legends, her sudden demise felt more like an unfinished trick than a final breath. Found alone in her private study, the scene had all the markings of calculated symbolism: a shattered crystal glass of aged cognac on the floor, a silver metronome stilled mid-tick, and a queen of spades delicately tucked into her bodice like a calling card from something ancient and vindictive. Hercule Mercier, long retired but eternally exacting, stood beside me with the calm of a man listening to music only he could hear. The guests, draped in couture and cultivated pretense, feigned solemnity but betrayed themselves with furtive glances and trembling hands. Monsieur Renard, a portly art dealer with the scent of turpentine and secrets clinging to him, insisted he'd last seen Isadora at the witching hour, claiming she was glowing, ecstatic, like a woman who had unlocked something forbidden. His words were poetic, but his eyes flickered too often toward the heavy velvet curtain near the fireplace, and I wondered what or who he feared might be listening. Claudine, his wife, once a famed soprano before her voice vanished mid-performance in Vienna, rolled her eyes and spoke sharply. "He's romanticizing again," I heard shouting at 1:13 a.m. Precisely. She was not glowing. She was terrified. The hotel staff had heard nothing, naturally, or claimed they hadn't. Yet Madame Rousseau, the concierge, admitted sotto voce that Isadora had dismissed her maid 3 days ago, demanding absolute privacy as she rehearsed for a finale the world wasn't ready for. Since then, Rousseau said, Isadora had received 3 unnamed visitors: a veiled mourner, whose gloved hands clutched a book of necromantic poetry; a silent child who entered without knocking and left without opening the door; and a woman with emerald gloves smelling of absinthe-scorched cedarwood, who reportedly laughed as she exited. None of these guests were officially registered. When Mercier and I entered Isadora's private quarters, it felt like walking into a painting with its soul torn out. Books lay open on the floor, texts on illusion, alchemy and antique funeral rites, while her prized white raven Lucian, once caged beside her mirror, had vanished entirely. In his place hung a torn piece of her final performance poster, pinned with a rusted sewing needle and threaded with crimson string soaked in an unidentifiable oily substance. "Staged," Mercier whispered, his eyes scanning each object as if they whispered back. The fireplace was unlit, but faint soot trails curled up the wallpaper above it, as if something had escaped through the stone. We discovered a hidden drawer beneath her writing desk, containing letters with no sender, each a riddle, each darker than the last. "You took her spotlight, now step into the dark." Her final note, unsigned, read only, "The trick is never the vanish. It's the return." Mercier turned slowly, his expression unreadable, then tapped the cold metronome once. Tick. "This was never meant to be her end," he murmured. "It was someone else's beginning." As we descended the staircase, a string quartet began playing in the atrium, a haunting off-tempo waltz that drifted through the corridors like a specter. Guests resumed their roles, sipping champagne, speaking in delicate tones, but I watched them closely, and realized some were actors in a far older drama than even they knew, and one among them, perhaps smiling, perhaps mourning, had pulled the strings of a performance that had only just begun. We made our way through the dim, echoing corridors of Hotel Vérité, where time seemed to move slower, each step on the mosaic floor reverberating like the soft toll of a distant bell, as if the very walls mourned the silence left behind by the famed soprano Célestine Ardent. The ornate sconces flickered against the high velvet-papered walls, casting trembling shadows that danced like forgotten spirits clinging to the air, thick with the scent of polished wood and something faintly metallic, perhaps the memory of blood. Her shrouded in hushed secrecy, at the farthest end of the east wing, felt more like a mausoleum than a residence. A lavender-toned sanctum with twin balconies that stared out onto the restless, darkening sea on one side, and the dense, murmuring cypress groves on the other. The garden below now swallowed in creeping dusk. "But Lambert," Inspector Moreau said quietly, his voice barely rising above the soft creak of the floorboards beneath us, "one must look beneath the elegance. Truth rarely wears silk." The door gave way to a chamber that felt less like a room and more like a stage, frozen mid-performance. Nothing was out of place, yet everything felt wrong. The furniture, a blend of antique French elegance and modern refinement, was arranged with such precision, it bordered on the obsessive. The grand piano stood like a dark sentinel in the corner, its lacquered lid reflecting the dying amber light, while atop it lay scattered sheets of music marked with frantic annotations, their ink strokes angry and uneven, layered in several distinct hands, as though rewritten by multiple minds, or by one mind slipping through multiple selves. A single crystal perfume bottle sat beside them, its stopper smeared with fingerprints, and the contents pungent, medicinal, more like something used to mask decay than to entice. The writing desk by the tall bay window showed clear signs of tampering. The leather blotter bore fresh ink stains, as if a quill had been dropped mid-thought, and a faint rectangular discoloration suggested something had been removed in haste. A journal perhaps, or a document too dangerous to remain. "Something was taken," I whispered. Moreau's gaze didn't move from the desk, or hidden, and not by chance. We proceeded to the adjoining bedroom, where the air grew noticeably colder. It was styled with the same meticulous elegance: plum velvet drapes, embroidered silk linens, gilt-framed mirrors, but there was a sterility beneath the softness, like a stage set abandoned after its final act. The open wardrobe revealed gowns of every conceivable hue, sequined and shadowed, but between them hung an empty velvet hanger, its clasp twisted, as though something had been torn away, perhaps in panic, or with purpose. She didn't pack lightly, I observed, already suspecting the answer. "Which means that someone packed for her," Moreau said grimly, eyes narrowing. But it was in the dressing alcove, a narrow chamber half hidden by a panel of lacquered wood, that the room yielded its secret. Moreau's fingers traced an irregular seam, and with a subtle push, a concealed compartment gave way to reveal a small leather-bound volume. No title, the leather cracked with age, but burnished with the oils of frequent handling. We expected a diary or a libretto, What lay inside was something far more unsettling. The pages were filled with strange inscriptions, glyphs and sigils intertwined with musical staffs that led nowhere, diagrams reminiscent of astrological charts, phrases scrawled in angular scripts that seemed to breathe and shift with the flicker of light. There were no dates, no context, only a pulsing sense of intention, as if the book were meant not to be read but decoded, and only by someone initiated into its mysteries. "This isn't a diary," I muttered. "It's a grimoire." Poirot didn't answer immediately. He was scanning the pages with a furrowed brow, fingertips tracing the edges as if testing for heat. "This isn't a cipher meant to hide gossip," he finally said. "It's meant to obscure power, something forbidden." A soft knock startled us both, pulling our focus back to the present. The door creaked open and Yvette, the maid who had discovered the body, stepped in slowly, her face pale, her knuckles white as they gripped the edge of her apron. Her eyes flicked uneasily toward the journal, then the piano as if she feared both equally. "Excusez-moi, monsieur," she said, voice thin. "I came to collect the linens, but I remembered something." Poirot nodded. "Go ahead." She swallowed hard. The night before she was humming something strange, a song I've never heard. I thought it was a rehearsal, but she began to laugh. Her voice cracked, not like herself, as if someone else was in the room, but no one had entered. A silence settled over us then, heavy, as if the suite itself had paused to listen. Poirot slowly closed the journal, the leather creaking faintly, like a breath held too long. "Whatever she was performing," he said quietly, "it wasn't for an audience of this world." And just then the shadows in the room seemed to shift, ever so slightly, as though something unseen had finally noticed us, and was now muffling even the smallest of movements, as the dying light of dusk seeped through the leaded glass windows and spilled across the black-veined marble floors in ominous pools of crimson and gold. The West Wing, long abandoned by most and spoken of, only in hushed tones among the servants, housed the private quarters of Seraphine Noel, the reclusive yet internationally revered soprano, whose voice had once filled opera houses across Europe with celestial grace. But now her suite stood deathly still, sealed like a mausoleum for a saint whose miracles had soured. The room itself was a cathedral of darkness and silence, Gothic arches, walls of dark rosewood, midnight blue drapery that drank in the light, and sconces that flickered with an unnatural sluggishness. It was as if time moved differently here. "Listen to this room, Lambert," murmured Inspector Duray beside me, his gloved fingers trailing across the carved edge of a writing desk that looked untouched by dust or time. "It doesn't echo, it absorbs." He was right. The silence wasn't absence, it was hunger. The scent that lingered in the air wasn't merely perfume, it was ritualistic. Iris and myrrh, yes, but layered with something metallic, something scorched. A single aria lay open on the lacquered piano, frozen mid-phrase, with strange jagged markings etched violently into the sheet. These weren't annotations, they were claw marks, made not with a pen but with desperation. Above the cold hearth a mirror fractured down the center reflected us in halves, two versions of ourselves severed by the room's unspoken truth. "She wasn't rehearsing," I said, and Duray responded with a grave nod. "She was trying to rewrite something immutable, something written not just in ink, but in fate." At her escritoire we found more disquiet. A shattered fountain pen still wet with ink, a blotter soaked through as if she'd been writing until her hand gave out. A torn envelope lay half-concealed beneath the desk, its seal split but its contents absent. The waste bin beside it was empty, eerily empty, as if even her discarded thoughts had been taken. In the bedroom beyond, things grew colder. Her wardrobe, more a reliquary than a closet, held garments too perfect, too ceremonial, each arranged with obsessive symmetry. But there, between two crimson gowns, a gap no larger than a finger's width suggested something had been removed in haste. It was beneath the dressing table, behind a warped panel that Duray's hand closed around something hidden. A book, leather-bound and unmarked, but humming with silent menace. We had expected journal entries, perhaps bitter poems or tragic farewells, but what we found inside were no words at all, only symbols, ink black and looping, drawn in endless circuits and sigils that twisted into each other like a language older than language. "This isn't a diary," Duray breathed. "It's a cipher, but not for messages, for something more sacred or more profane. Before I could ask what he meant, a knock came, sharp and unnatural in the stillness. It was Leia, the laundress, who had discovered Seraphine's body. She entered like a ghost trailing sorrow, her hands trembling and her eyes rimmed with rain. She was kind, Leia whispered, almost too softly to hear, always gentle with me. But the last week, she changed. She barely slept. She would ask me no, beg me, to tell her who came and who left, what I heard in the halls, which guests argued, which rooms stayed locked. Her voice cracked. Twice I found her on the balcony in the middle of the night, singing, but it wasn't her voice. It was lower, older, and once she laughed like someone else had spoken through her. Derae stepped forward. Did anyone visit her? Leia hesitated, as though afraid her words might summon something. A man, she said finally, tall, thin, pale as paper. He never came through the lobby. He climbed like a shadow up to her balcony. I saw him once from the service corridor, just standing there, watching her, and when he left, she would light incense, cry, then whisper to the mirror. One time, I think she asked it a question, and waited. We let Leia go, the weight of her words hanging in the air like smoke. Derae returned to the book, now seated in Seraphine's reading chair, the firelight dancing against the strange ink. These symbols, they loop like intervals in a scale, he murmured, tracing them as if hearing something I could not. Not notes, not words, but a structure, a key maybe. Not to music but to something hidden in sound. I leaned in, heart pounding. The perfume that lingered in the room now struck me differently. Lavender, yes. But also ash, iron. It's not just perfume, I said. It's covering something. A scent, or something worse. Derae nodded slowly, his eyes drifting toward the piano again. Not to hide from the dead Lambert, he said, but from something that still listens. As we turned to leave, I glanced once more at the cracked mirror, and froze. Our reflections did not turn with us. They remained, standing perfectly still, their eyes locked forward, waiting, watching, and it was then I realized. Seraphine had not been rehearsing. The aria she had rewritten was never meant to be performed for an audience. It was a summons, a beckoning in the language of forgotten God. And now, whatever had heard her, was beginning to answer. The cold, poison-tinged Mediterranean breeze swept across the terrace, slicing through the guarded silence with the faint rustle of paper. Inspector René Vallon sat hunched on an ancient stone bench on the balcony of Villa Mistral, surrounded by the rhythmic whispers of crashing waves. He leaned over a scattering of cryptic documents. Line by line, the pages bore continuous calculations, understandable only to someone who grasped the thread that wove death and melody together. His eyes held the same intensity found in a maestro composing his final symphony. The silence broke only when his voice rang out, as clear and deliberate as a tolling bell. This isn't a cipher, Henry, it's a schedule. But not for concerts. These are meeting times, and the ones meeting, they weren't musicians. I sat beside him, but everything felt strangely foreign in that moment. The warmth of the bench, the fluttering air, the endless stretch of deep blue sea. It was as if someone had drained the soul from the surroundings. Are you saying she wasn't just an artist? I asked softly. Vallon nodded. Madeleine Derain's final piece wasn't a farewell, it was a signal, and someone had been waiting for it. Our next encounter was with Count Lucien d'Armois, a man who wore his title not with pride, but like a well-crafted man. His study was awash in golden light, yet his face bore the weariness of a sleepless night. His collar slightly askew, dark shadows under his eyes, and a restlessness that clung to men who always feel what. Vallon began gently but firmly. We've learned that you met with Madeleine the night before her death. The Count's hand froze mid-reach, the untouched coffee before him suddenly heavy with implication. It was just a conversation, he murmured, a chance to clarify something long buried. But his eyes told another story, a tale he seemed afraid to let surface. Paris, Milan, Prague, Istanbul. You didn't just share music, Vallon continued. You shared secrets. The Count's gaze darkened instantly. You've done your digging, Inspector, and you've done your hiding, Vallon retorted. There was a pause. Then the Count's voice dropped to a hush that felt heavier than any shout. We were operatives, both of us, Behind the Cultural Alliance was a hidden mission. Madeline carried coded messages embedded in sheet music. Each beat of the orchestra masked a secret. Every performance was a cover. My breath caught in my throat. "You're saying she wanted out?" The Count nodded solemnly. "She was tired, she was scared, but those around her insisted she continue at any cost." Then he shared something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. She said her final composition wasn't hers. An anonymous sheet arrived, unsigned. Just a title. "Elegy for the Unheard." She practiced it for hours. She said there was something inside it. Something calling to her. Calling to her, I echoed. She said the piece didn't summon an emotion. It summoned a presence. She told me that if she played the final note there wouldn't just be applause. Something else would come. Something that always stopped before. But this time it wouldn't. Vallon looked at me then, his eyes mirroring the same dread that had begun to swell in my chest. Below the terrace, the sea roared louder, more restless than before. And then, as if someone had awakened a stage that had remained silent for centuries, a faint violin note drifted through the air. Not from a musician. Not from any stage. It was a message, a whisper, proof that something had been listening. And now, it was coming. A heavy stillness cloaked the Monteverdi Hotel's sea-facing terrace, as if even the golden Mediterranean light dared not disturb the coiling dread that hung in the air. A hush so profound it muffled even the rustling of the olive trees and the faint lapping of waves below. Inspector Laurent Delacroix stood motionless by the marble balustrade, his weathered fingers grazing the edge of a dossier that pulsed with dangerous secrets, its pages thick with the weight of conspiracy, fractured code sequences, torn journal entries singed at the edges, and sepia-toned photographs where one gaunt figure, tall, cloaked, face always averted, appeared like a recurring ghost in the backdrop of embassies, train stations and candlelit concert halls. "This wasn't a farewell," Delacroix murmured, eyes narrowed, voice laced with dread. "It was a warning masked as a finale." Behind him the discreet yet visibly shaken concierge Camille Moreau approached with uncharacteristic hesitation, her heels echoing too loudly in the quiet. "Monsieur," she whispered, eyes darting to the corners of the terrace as though shadows might be listening. "A man came asking for you. He didn't give a room number, only a name. Rook. He left the..." In her gloved hand trembled a brass metronome, antique and elegant, its pendulum swaying despite no one winding it. Delacroix's breath caught. Rook was not a name spoken lightly. It belonged to a ghost from a darker chapter of European intelligence, one long thought buried in Vienna's frozen back alleys and Lisbon's whispered café. She referenced him, Delacroix said, flipping open the dossier to a crimson-marked page. "When Rook moves, the Queen falls." With sudden urgency, he turned to Camille. "We must access Suite 914. Immediately, the air inside the room was dense, almost theatrical, as though time had been staged to freeze the moment of her death. Vivienne Darcy's private suite was still arranged like the final act of a sinister opera, an overturned wine glass, its blood-red contents still wet on the carpet. A delicate music box shattered across the floor as if flung, yet oddly placed too far from its usual spot, and that cloying aroma of roses, not from a bouquet but released by heat-reactive perfume, triggered only when the room reached a precise temperature. Delacroix knelt beside the piano, where a faint, dusty footprint too large to be Vivienne's revealed a recent and deliberate intrusion. She was afraid, he whispered, eyes scanning every object with renewed suspicion, afraid enough to rig her own room with musical traps. Beneath the grand piano, tucked just out of sight, they found a folded piece of sheet music, its title scrawled in elegant but sharp penmanship, Requiem for a Voice Silent. Turning it over, Delacroix discovered a string of coordinates, ones he instantly recognized from a Corsican dossier, a decommissioned satellite relay station, marked abandoned but long suspected to house ghost operations. Scribbled beside it in a desperate hand, "Final verse must never be sung." Camille's voice faltered. "Inspector, who was she?" Delacroix didn't respond at once, his mind reeling. Vivienne Darcy hadn't just sung operas. She encoded secrets within her arias, weaving political truths and intelligence into music only certain trained ears could decipher. Her concerts were confessions, her rehearsals rendezvous, and someone had decided that her final performance would also be her last breath. Just then a knock rapped softly on the door, too gentle, too precisely timed to be innocent. Delacroix froze, hand on his concealed weapon, heart drumming. The metronome on the side table stopped ticking without warning, its pendulum halting mid-swing. In that chilling silence Delacroix understood. This wasn't the end of a case. This was the overture of a much deeper conspiracy. Vivienne's death was a beginning, a signal to those still listening, and to those still watching from the shadow. As the crimson twilight settled like spilled wine over the Italian countryside, we were ushered once again into the private quarters of Countess Isidora Moretti, whose reputation for discretion was as formidable as the influence of her late husband, the Italian ambassador to Vienna. The room itself seemed suspended in time, an opulent sitting chamber paneled in dark cherry wood, where antique sconces cast flickering amber light across velvet drapes and ancestral portraits, whose eyes seemed to follow us with knowing disapproval. The Countess sat alone at a vintage escritoire beneath a high-arched window, a half-written letter lying still, the ink smeared as if the weight of unspoken truths had frozen her hand mid-thought. She didn't rise immediately, her fingers nervously tracing the rim of a delicate Venetian glass, but when she did stand, her poise betrayed a subtle fracture beneath its elegance. "Monsieur Lieutenant Vale," she greeted with a voice both weary and formal. "I have been expecting you, though I had prayed I wouldn't." There was something eerie in how composed she remained, as though grief and fear had long ago been folded into her posture. Devereux, always gentle with women on the edge of ruin, stepped forward. "Then you're aware we've learned more than what was initially disclosed about Allegra's activity." At the mention of Allegra Valois, the mysterious opera singer turned informant. Isidora turned toward the window, her silhouette bathed in fading sunlight, the sheer veil over her shoulder catching a breeze that wasn't there. "If by activities you mean encrypted correspondences tucked inside piano sonatas, rendezvous with diplomats under the guise of charity galas, and secret passages through neutral borders, then yes, but I doubt even you know the half of it." Her voice cracked faintly, but not from fear, from the effort of restraint. Then she turned to face us again, and what she said next changed the tone of the room entirely. "Allegra and I, we were not just companions," she said softly. "We were in love." The silence that followed was almost violent in its intensity, broken only by the distant chime of the old mantel clock. Her admission did not come with shame, only unbearable finality. "It began in Barcelona 3 winters ago during a peace summit my husband attended. I was a dignitary's ornament, paraded in pearls and protocol. She was performing Tosca, and I lost all sense of duty the moment she sang." Allegra was not merely a woman, she was defiance wrapped in silk, the embodiment of a life I was never allowed to live. Our love grew in shadows, not because we were ashamed but because the world around us demanded it. But then the letters came, anonymous, typed on an old machine, each word razor sharp. No demands, no threats, just whispered truths twisted into poison, designed to unravel the silence we had so carefully preserved. My husband Antonio began watching me with suspicion, not because he loved me, but because his reputation could not afford scandal. Allegra meanwhile became distant. She warned me, again and again, "Say nothing, know nothing. Silence will keep you alive." But even her courage began to crack. In the final weeks, she began to encode messages into her performances, subtle shifts in lyrics, pauses that weren't in the original score. Her last aria, it was a goodbye wrapped in warning. The Countess moved to the mantel where an array of photos stood, smiling faces at galas, official visits, but one picture stood out, Allegra, laughing mid-turn, her face half lit, half lost in shadow. She told me someone from within the embassies, someone powerful, wanted her silenced. She had discovered something that could ruin more than reputations. And then, she vanished. Devereux leaned in, his tone low and urgent. "The red silk glove found in the bishop's balcony, was it yours?" The question hung like a blade. The Countess looked away, her breath caught. "No," she said finally, "but it was meant for me to find." Her voice trembled now. Not from sorrow but dread. You don't understand. Whoever is orchestrating this, they're not after money. They're scrubbing the past clean. Erasing every trace of dissent, of forbidden truths, of love that defied the script we were handed. Allegra was just the beginning. As a gust of wind rattled the high window panes, and thunder rolled faintly across the distant hills, her eyes locked onto Devereux's. This is no longer about betrayal or politics, she whispered. This is a war for memory itself, and in wars like these, the dead speak loudest. How did you know? Her voice barely rose above the hush of the velvet-curtained chamber, each word carrying the weight of something long buried. Yes, it was mine, the Countess finally admitted after a breathless pause, her fingertips trembling as they grazed the frayed edge of the silk scarf lying on the table like a relic from a past she had fought to forget. It was one of Ariel's favorite. She said the color reminded her of twilight over the Ligurian coast, that faint lavender haze that lingers just before the stars emerge. I left it in her dressing suite several days ago. I thought it would stay hidden there, with the rest of what we never said aloud. But when I heard it was discovered in the corridor, just outside Minister Halvorst's private suite, I realized someone was unraveling things I'd barely dared admit, even to myself. Devereux leaned forward slightly, his tone even but edged with tension. Can you explain how it came to be there? The Countess hesitated, her eyes flicked toward the fireplace, as if searching for an escape into the flames. I retrieved it the night before her final performance. I went to see her, not just to wish her well but to say goodbye. She told me that it would be the last time we met. After her farewell performance, she was going to disappear. No tours, no goodbyes. She said she needed to vanish for both our sakes. She wanted to sever all ties, and she did it with the same precision she used to arrange every note in her aria. Her fingers gripped the chair's carved armrests, knuckles whitening, but something was wrong. Ariel wasn't herself. She kept looking toward the drawn curtains, glancing at the mirror with dread, as if she expected it to show her something she couldn't escape. She was anxious, not nervous, like she knew something terrible was already set in motion. She returned everything I'd ever given her, letters, jewelry, little sketches, said it was safer if nothing could be traced. Her hands were cold. Her voice cracked when she said she loved me, but couldn't let me follow her into whatever was coming. Devereux's voice softened. What time did you leave her? Around 7, she replied after a pause, her words fragile. I intended to return to my suite and prepare for the gala, but in the corridor, just outside her room, I encountered Minister Halvorst. He looked hollow, not just tired, agitated, pale, like someone who'd seen something that couldn't be unseen. When I dropped the scarf, he practically dove to retrieve it as if it were more than just silk. He warned me, said Ariel had made enemies far more powerful than I could imagine, that she had information people would kill to bury. He told me to stay away, that she was being watched, that we all were. The Countess sagged back in her chair, the truth weighing on her like chain. I thought he was being dramatic, paranoid, but now, she looked directly at Devereux, and for the first time her grief burned with anger. Now I believe him. Ariel was meticulous. She never missed doses. She didn't drink. She didn't take anything unless it was measured, counted, verified. The idea that she accidentally poisoned herself, it's a lie, a fabrication. Someone wanted her silent, and they timed it too perfectly right after the curtain fell. Devereux was silent for a long moment before asking, do you believe she was murdered? The Countess didn't blink. I believe someone feared what she knew, but I also believe they underestimated her. Ariel didn't just gather secrets. She organized them, catalogued them. She showed me once a sliver of a dossier hidden behind the false panel of her piano bench. Names, bank transactions, blackmail letters, surveillance footage, enough to dismantle careers, dynasties, governments. She called it her insurance hour. If anything happened to her, she said the truth would not remain buried for long. He leaned closer. Do you know where those documents are now? She shook her head slowly. No, she never told me. Only that the answer lay in something only I would understand. A reference to our first meeting, our first conversation, she said. It's in the place that made me cry. I don't know what she meant, I remember her weeping, but I don't know which painting it was, or what it represents. As Devereux stood to leave, he noticed the Countess's fingers moving almost mechanically, tearing the corner of a letter she had begun writing when they arrived. The pieces fluttered to the floor like snowflakes, lost in the golden lamplight, delicate remnants of a woman being torn apart from within. Her grief was real, but beneath it something sharper pulsed. Resolve. One last question, Devereux said gently, pausing by the doorway. The perfume bottle shattered on Ariel's vanity. Had you seen it before? She nodded. Yes. It was her signature scent. It was designed for her by a perfumer in Florence, bergamot, heather and amber. The bottle was distinct. Bohemian crystal, hand-cut, shaped like a flame. The one found broken in her room. Her voice faltered, then steeled again. That was a cheap replica, common glass. Someone replaced it. Even that intimate thing, her scent, was imitated, as if someone wanted to erase the last trace of her. As we walked back through the hotel's grand echoing halls, the chandeliers above flickering like distant constellations, I felt the walls press closer, as though the building itself had absorbed her secrets. The Countess's grief haunted the corridor like perfume lingering in the dark. What had begun as a tragic loss was now clearly a calculated silence, an assassination wrapped in elegance. The picture of Ariel was becoming clearer, a woman caught not just between love and fame, but between those who sought to use her, and those who feared what she knew. Dangerous allegiances had ensnared her in a web far beyond the glamorous stage, and though the tragedy still echoed with unanswered questions, I sensed that Armand was beginning to piece together a deeper orchestration, a hidden rhythm to events only he could decipher. Chapter 6. The Prodigy's Vow. The morning after our unsettling exchange with Lady Bellamy found Armand seated in quiet solitude, his gaze fixed upon a series of hand-drawn diagrams, musical notations, and cross-referenced excerpts from Emilienne's private journal, which he had spent the better part of the night decrypting. "The cipher sings at last," he murmured, tapping a thin pencil against the parchment. "But the melody it reveals is not sweet, mon ami. It is dirge-like and dangerous." What began as whispers of a smuggling network now pointed to something more sprawling, more insidious, a lattice of influence and betrayal wrapped in arias, performance contracts and whispered code. Names like Le Spectre and the Wren surfaced repeatedly. Illnesses, yes, but assigned to players in a game larger than any of us anticipated. One name, however, refused to hide behind metaphor. Anneli. It was this discovery that propelled us toward the theater's inner sanctum once more, where we found Annelier Marceau, Emilienne's once unknown protégée, now seated alone beneath the soft shadows of the rehearsal lights, her fingers drifting across the silent piano as if conjuring the ghost of her mentor. Armand's voice broke the stillness gently, yet with authority. "Mademoiselle Marceau, forgive the intrusion, but we seek truth in a place shadowed by illusion." She looked up slowly, and the transformation in her was unmistakable. Her youth had not vanished, but it had been tempered by grief and something harder to name, a watchfulness perhaps, or the first glint of steel beneath her sorrow. "I wasn't rehearsing," she said softly, voice distant as though she spoke through a fog. "I was listening to the silence between the notes. Emilienne used to say that's where the truth lived." Her hands hovered over the score, lingering on a haunting aria she called The Lament of Ashes, a piece never publicly performed. "She taught me this in secret. It was her most vulnerable composition." She said it captured the exact moment she realized the stage could be both sanctuary and prison. At the mention of this hidden work, Armand's eyes narrowed. "You were close to her, closer than most." Annelier gave a slow nod. "She rescued me from obscurity, taught me how to sing. Yes, but more than that, how to disappear when needed." Emilienne was many things, but naive was never one of them. She knew the risks. She told me, "If I vanish, it's because someone forced my silence." Armand leaned forward slightly, voice lower now. "And yet your name appears repeatedly in her encoded writings. Notes on covert meetings, transcripts of intercepted communiqué. What was your role in her other life? The one beyond the stage?" Annelier stood, slowly, eyes glinting with emotion, not quite anger, not quite fear, something unresolved. She crossed to the velvet-curtained window, watching the garden below where petals drifted like falling secrets. She wanted to keep me clean, she whispered, told me never to touch the fire she danced through, but I insisted. I wanted to help her. No, to protect her, because I knew someday the past she'd buried would try to claw its way back. She turned to face us fully, her voice shaking now with restrained fury. You think she died because she slipped or overdosed? Emilienne kept exact journals of every drop she consumed. No, someone wanted her gone, and they made sure the final curtain fell before she could reveal them. Armand's expression darkened. Do you know what she was about to expose? Annelier nodded once. Not the names, but the plan. She said something was coming, a performance that would shatter reputations. She said she had planted the truth in a place only her sorrow remembered, and that I, alone, would understand when the moment came. Armand's breath caught. Did she ever say which place? Annelier walked to the piano, lifting the lid gently to reveal a note tucked beneath the keys, weathered, smudged with fingerprints. She handed it to Armand without a word. It read simply, the aria that broke me, the one that no one ever heard. As Armand unfolded the note, I realized we were no longer chasing a simple mystery. We were standing at the edge of a composition built on betrayal, loss, and encoded revenge, and the final verse had yet to be played. I was young and foolish. Marguerite's voice wavered like the last note of a fading song, her eyes distant, as though peering into a memory she had never truly left. I thought it was all so noble, so poetic, like something torn from an old adventure novel. Swords in the dark whispered codes, stolen glances across candlelit ballrooms. I didn't see the shadows behind the page. Her fingers toyed nervously with the edge of a silk scarf knotted at her wrist, nervous energy seeping through every motion. I only did small things at first, delivering folded notes, distracting officials at galas, while Celeste met with her contacts behind velvet curtains. I believed I was fighting for freedom, for democracy, for something beautiful. Her lips twisted bitterly, but it wasn't beauty, it was illusion. She looked away, her voice growing taut. In the last year, Celeste began to change. Her laughter grew quieter, her eyes started searching every room as if the walls themselves could hear. She told me something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. The network, it had become something else, ruthless. People were vanishing, some found dead in bathtubs, others lost to fires no one could explain. Convenient accidents, she called them. She was scared, more than I'd ever seen her. She said they wouldn't let her leave. Marguerite's eyes shimmered with something raw. So she made a decision. If she couldn't escape, she would expose them. She began documenting everything, every clandestine meeting, every cryptic exchange. She wrote it all down with terrifying precision, not just as protection, but to clear her conscience. She said, if they take me, at least the truth will follow. She paused, then moved quietly to the piano bench, where sheet music lay stacked neatly. Lifting the top layer, she retrieved a manila envelope sealed in crimson wax, aged but unmistakably intact. She gave this to me, Marguerite said softly. One of many copies. She never trusted one person with all the pieces. She said the truth was safest scattered. Poirot accepted the envelope carefully, but she wasn't finished. Her voice dropped lower. The night she died, we had a plan. She was going to give a signal before the final performance. If it was safe to proceed, she'd leave her dressing room door slightly ajar. If she sensed danger, she'd lock the door and place a specific piece of music, Elegy for a False Spring, on her music stand. Marguerite's hands now gripped the edge of the piano tightly, but when I went to check, there was nothing. The door was closed but not locked, the stand completely bare. It was like she never had the chance to decide. Her voice cracked. It was shortly after 8. I waited in the corridor, hoping she was delayed, but deep down, I knew, and I did nothing. You would have joined her fate, Poirot said gently, though his eyes were cold with calculation. Whoever orchestrated her end anticipated disruption. I examined the envelope, and then noticed something odd. In the corner, barely visible, was a tiny string of musical notes scrawled in ink. They seemed hauntingly familiar. This notation, I asked. Do you know it? Marguerite looked and nodded instantly, the corners of her mouth trembling. It's O mio babino caro, the opening bar. Celeste used it as a signature, on everything that mattered, My mind flashed to the Countess's earlier whisper of the same aria. A pattern began to reveal itself. Not in words, but in music. The melody again, I said. Poirot nodded slowly. Yes, mon ami. Like a motif echoing through a tragic symphony. He tucked the envelope into his jacket with almost reverent care, then turned to Marguerite, his expression grave. You've done something very dangerous, and very brave. But you must be careful now. Whoever silenced Mademoiselle Valois will not hesitate to do so again, if they sense a threat. Marguerite's chin lifted. I'm not afraid anymore. Celeste saved me once from a life of secrets, of compromise, of being someone else's pawn. Now I have the chance to save her name. I won't run. As we stepped into the dimming twilight of the theater corridor, the solemn hush was broken by the faint, mournful sound of the piano behind us. Marguerite had returned to the bench, and her fingers moved slowly across the keys, replaying the same opening notes of O mio babbino caro, a melody now forever bound to tragedy, treachery, and the first unraveling threads of a deadly conspiracy that was far from over. We walked back through the Grand Hotel's corridors, their fading glamour tinged with a quiet melancholy that clung to the air like perfume in an abandoned dressing room, the perfect stage for a woman whose final performance had ended not in applause but in silence. Yet beneath the solemn whisper of the music echoing faintly from the Grand Salon, I could feel something shifting, an invisible thread tightening, a rhythm gaining tempo. The fragments we had gathered once scattered like broken glass, now began to shimmer in alignment, suggesting the outline of a greater, darker design just beneath the surface. That evening, Chapter 7 began not with words, but with silence and smoke. Armed with the newly unearthed documents from Marguerite Dubois, Poirot had spent the entire afternoon immersed in concentration, his brow furrowed, his eyes darting between Celeste's encoded journal and faded opera scores, the sea glowing gold beyond his suite window. I found him surrounded by a sea of annotated pages and scrawled staff notations, as the sun sank into the Mediterranean. Ah, mon ami, he said without looking up, his voice bright with the unmistakable satisfaction of a mind on the verge of victory. The little grey cells, they have danced beautifully this afternoon. We have a breakthrough. I settled across from him, the air electric with expectation. The cipher? I asked. He nodded, eyes gleaming. It is not a mere musical code as I once believed. No, Mademoiselle Valois was far more ingenious. She employed harmonic progressions, complex ones, tied to specific operatic area. Each journal entry corresponds to a different piece, and within the framework of that musical structure, the notes themselves translate into letters, depending on their harmonic relationships. It is, how do you say, a symphony of secrecy. I blinked, half lost in the technicality, but fully captivated. And what did it reveal? His face darkened. A vast network, mon ami. One that trafficked not in art alone but in information. Secrets of industry, whispers of war, political blackmail, even stolen troop movements, all passed through the veil of culture, hidden behind the pretense of diplomacy and music festivals. And it was all coordinated. He paused just as a hesitant knock interrupted. Marie, the young hotel maid, stood at the door, her posture rigid, eyes shadowed with anxiety. Pardon, monsieur, she whispered, but I must speak. There are things I didn't say before. I was frightened. Poirot gestured gently for her to enter. Perching nervously on the edge of the chair, she wrung her hands in her apron as though trying to twist the truth from her own memory. After we spoke, she began, voice low. I remembered something from the night Mademoiselle Valois died. I saw the German man Hinri. He came to her balcony, as he often did, but this time, he left quickly. Barely 5 minutes, and he carried something, a black leather case like a doctor's bag. I'd never seen him carry anything before. Poirot leaned forward, eyes sharp. At what time? Around 7, maybe a little after. I was turning down beds nearby when I saw him slip into the garden, looking around like he expected to be followed. Poirot nodded gravely. And was there anyone else? Marie hesitated, her lips trembling. There was someone else, a woman. I wasn't supposed to see her, I think. Madame Armitage. She came up the service stairs. A guest like her. That's strange enough, but she didn't look lost. She knew exactly where she was going. She had a small package wrapped in brown paper. I saw her near Mademoiselle Valois' suite. She knocked so softly. I thought no one would hear. When there was no answer, she used a key. She had a key to that room. She stayed only a few minutes. When she left, she no longer carried the package. Poirot exchanged a look with me, one heavy with implication. Marie excused herself, trembling as she closed the door behind her. Poirot rose slowly, the room heavy with unsaid things. "We have entered the crescendo," he murmured, "and I fear the final note will be fatal for someone yet to be named." As our car wound its way through the desolate, pine-shrouded roads of the Côte d'Azur, the sun a fading smear behind the horizon, and the Mediterranean a dark sheet of steel below, Poirot sat in complete silence, his eyes fixed on the shifting shadows outside as though reading secrets written in the passing night. There was a stillness about him, not of calm but of calculation, like a chess master seeing 5 moves ahead while the rest of us saw only the board. Finally he spoke, his voice a soft, deliberate murmur. "Hastings, we are no longer chasing a murderer. We are unmasking an artist." Our destination was not the famed perfumeries of Grasse as previously believed, but a far more discreet and unsettling location, a forgotten atelier perched atop a jagged cliff in Gordon, run by a reclusive former military chemist, named Monsieur Renaud. According to Poirot, only someone with advanced chemical knowledge could have manipulated the exact composition of scent that had quite literally become the instrument of death. The moment we stepped into Renaud's shadowy workshop, heavy with the layered smells of herbs, oils and decay, there was a chill that crept up my spine, not from the cold but from the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. Renaud, a gaunt man with glassy eyes and trembling fingers, confessed that a woman had come to him under the guise of being Celeste Valois' personal assistant, bearing a sample of her signature lavender blend and demanding he replicate it, but with exacting modification. She insisted on a dramatically intensified concentration, a shift so subtle and sinister, it would pass as normal to the untrained nose, but could alter mood, impair cognition, and if inhaled over time, possibly induce cardiac distress. When Renaud hesitated, suspecting her intentions, the woman turned cold, threatening, her sharp British accented French slicing the air. Though he claimed to have refused her, he later discovered a test vial missing, stolen during a break-in. 2 nights later, an act Poirot suspected had been premeditated, not desperate. The moment he revealed this, I felt a cold shiver crawl through my chest. This wasn't just a poisoning, it was a performance, a theatrical execution dressed in elegance and fragrance. Back at the Hotel Splendid, now stripped of its former glamour and revealed as the silent witness to something monstrous, Poirot and I revisited Celeste's room. Under lamplight, he located a silk scarf tucked behind the vanity mirror, soaked faintly with the same pungent artificial lavender, a scent too strong, too cloying, unlike the refined original. The bottle on her dresser, once crystal bohemian cut to catch the light in a specific refraction, had been replaced with a cheap imitation, common glass, masked to pass as the original. Poirot's brow furrowed deeper, as he interviewed the hotel staff discreetly, each whisper building the mosaic in his mind. The concierge, initially hesitant, revealed he had seen Mrs. Armitage enter Celeste's suite days before the murder, claiming she was returning a brooch, yet no such brooch was ever logged in lost and found. A chambermaid, pale with guilt, admitted she had overheard a whispered argument between Celeste and the Armitage in the Winter Garden, where the phrase "exposing everything" was hissed in panic. It was clear, Celeste had become a threat, a liability. She had grown tired of being a pawn in a larger game, and had perhaps planned to reveal the existence of the covert information network, run behind the facade of musical tours and social galas. Poirot's voice was a whisper that cut like a knife in the dark. She was silenced, Hastings, not out of cruelty, but strategy. Mrs. Armitage, Lomber, the shadow herself, removed the one light bright enough to reveal her, And what better way than with a perfume? Her own signature, turned into her execution. As we stood on the balcony watching the lights of Nice shimmer like distant stars, Poirot folded his arms and let the silence breathe between us. Tomorrow, he said, we summon the cast of this carefully orchestrated drama, and before them all we strip away the masks. But tonight I must ensure we are not watching an illusion within an illusion. And in that moment, I realized something that made my stomach clench. There was still one detail Poirot hadn't yet shared, a final missing thread he was holding back until the last possible second. And whatever it was, it would change everything. The grand salon of the Hotel des Eclipses was shrouded in an eerie, almost theatrical stillness, as if the walls themselves anticipated the storm about to unfold. The dying sun cast jagged golden shards across the velvet drapes and parquet floors, transforming the room into a stage set for confession and reckoning. Chairs had been arranged not casually but deliberately, like chess pieces positioned for a final gambit, and in their seats sat those who had danced, knowingly or not, around the shadow of death. Baron von Stryker's knuckles whitened on the carved arms of his chair, his posture still sharp with military rigidity, though the twitch beneath his eye betrayed the pressure mounting within. Countess Livia Marceau, draped in charcoal silk, looked every bit the picture of mourning, but her fingers moved rhythmically against her clutch, a silent tell of tension she could no longer suppress. The Arlingtons, Calvin and Evelyn, sat dead center, their expressions a mask of performative calm, though Evelyn's heel tapped ceaselessly beneath her gown, each click like a metronome ticking toward doom. Margot Delange perched on the edge of her seat near the hearth, as if ready to flee at the first opportunity, her face a study in barely contained panic. Poirot stood at the head of the room like a conductor before a dissonant orchestra, his hands folded neatly behind his back, his gaze sharp enough to pierce stone. Mesdames, Messieurs, he began, his voice soft but cutting, we gather not to speculate but to unveil. The death of Mademoiselle Elise Renaud was no mere accident, no fainting spell followed by a tragic fall. It was an assassination cloaked in elegance, a death so artfully arranged that only the smallest details, the ones overlooked by most, whispered the truth. A murmur rippled through the room, but Poirot pressed on. The perfume bottle shattered that night was no accident. It was the climax of a carefully scripted deception, its overpowering floral fog meant to veil not only the truth, but the scent of murder itself, specifically cyanide, its bitter almond trace buried beneath layers of synthetic jasmine and hyper-concentrated rosewood. A gasp escaped from Margot while the Baron's face turned ashen, but the poison, mes amis, was not swallowed, not injected, not even inhaled in the traditional sense. It was absorbed through the skin, through the very act of beauty, via a reformulated perfume that looked identical to the original but was laced with death. And who but one intimately familiar with Mademoiselle Renaud's habits, with access to her dressing room, and with the means to switch the bohemian crystal flacon with a counterfeit, would know how to do so without raising alarm? Poirot's eyes locked onto Evelyn Arlington, who stiffened but remained silent. A week before the murder, a woman posing as a member of the hotel staff entered Elise's room, claiming to be there for a routine amenities inventory. No such procedure was no such woman was ever identified. But Madame Arlington, Poirot stepped closer, his gaze like a scalpel. You were seen descending from the servants' stairwell shortly thereafter, your gloves curiously stained with a substance later confirmed to be acetone, a common solvent used in glasswork. Evelyn laughed, a short brittle sound, but it was Calvin who now spoke, voice thick with strain. This is absurd. Do you mean to suggest my wife? No, Monsieur Arlington, Poirot cut in. I do not suggest, I reveal, for we have evidence, not merely testimony. But the scent traces on the scarf Elise was last seen wearing, the fingerprints lifted from the interior of the replacement bottle, and most damning of all, a receipt for a private courier dispatch to Berlin, signed with a name that Evelyn Arlington once used as her nom de guerre, E.V. The silence was absolute, thick, almost suffocating, until Countess Marceau let out a single choked sob. Poirot paused, letting the weight of the moment settle like dust after a bomb blast. Madame Arlington did not act alone. She was part of a larger network, one that Elise had threatened to expose. That is why she had to die, not because of jealousy or revenge, but because she became an inconvenient witness to treason hidden beneath champagne and music. He turned to the inspector. Monsieur de la Tour, you may now proceed with the arrests. The performance, he said quietly, is over. But as the inspector moved, Evelyn did not run, did not cry. She merely smiled, slow and chilling, and whispered, "You've only seen the first act, Monsieur Poirot. The curtain has yet to fall." And with those words the scent of roses seemed to thicken once more in the air, and I knew in the marrow of my bones, this mystery was far from done. The great hall of the Château de Lune shimmered with a deceptive tranquility, as dusk bled into night, the last gold streaks of sun casting twisted shadows across velvet drapes and crystal sconces. The air was unnaturally still, like the moment before a lightning strike. Every guest had returned, not out of obligation, but because they had to, some out of curiosity, others from fear, and a few because they knew the end had arrived. Inspector Lucien Duval, flanked by two silent gendarmes, and the ticking of an antique grandfather clock, took center stage on the marble dais, his voice calm but razor-sharp. "Tonight," he began, "we do not seek justice, for justice, mes amis, already stalks this room like a spectre. We seek truth." Eyes flicked nervously around the candlelit chamber as the inspector's gaze settled on the crimson chaise near the fountain sculpture, where the late Elise Moreau, opera soprano and wartime informant, was last seen alive. "The poison was not in the wine," Duval said, voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "nor in the caviar as some have speculated. No, it was hidden in something more intimate, more deceptive, the ink of the final aria she was rehearsing." Gasps rippled through the room. The sheet music found near her body had been treated with a thin layer of thallium-based compound. Colorless, tasteless, lethal. Every time she touched a page, a microscopic amount transferred to her fingertips, and every time she adjusted her lipstick, as she often did. He paused, letting the implication strike. The elderly Count Bellamy dropped his brandy snifter, glass shattering. "But why?" stammered Madame de Rosier, her diamond choker trembling with each breath. Duval turned to her, eyes glinting. "Because Elise discovered what was never meant to be found. A cipher embedded within the original score of Vespers, for the Forgotten. A wartime composition commissioned under the guise of national morale, but secretly used to encode Swiss bank codes and routes for smuggling stolen art. She found one too many secrets, and paid for her curiosity with her life." The room burst into hushed arguments, accusations flying like daggers, but Duval raised a hand. "There is more. The fountain," he gestured, "was recently drained. Inside the base, a lockbox containing correspondence between Elise and a man named C. These letters outlined her intention to expose the conspiracy. Not just theft but betrayal. The betrayal of soldiers, of families, of the country itself." He stepped forward, voice growing colder. "And that is why you killed her, isn't it, Monsieur Armand?" All eyes snapped to the pianist seated in the corner, who had accompanied Elise every evening without fail. His fingers, once dancing over ivory keys, were now motionless claws clenching the velvet armrest. "She was going to ruin everything," he whispered hoarsely. "Years of orchestrated balance, of carefully maintained silence. You think peace is won through idealism. It's bought, paid for in blood and gold. So you poisoned her," Duval replied, "and made it look like fate. An artist struck down before her final performance." Armand stood, trembling, then broke into bitter laughter. "You fools never understood. She was never the victim. She was the final note in a symphony of lies." As guards seized him, a hidden panel behind the organ clicked open with the faintest hiss, revealing reels of audio recordings, neatly labeled and meticulously catalogued. Duval allowed himself a thin smile. Every movement, every confession. Elise was recording it all, even her murder. The stunned silence returned, heavier than ever, and in that silence, as the first notes of the aria echoed from an unseen speaker, the ghosts of truth at last began to sing. Hissed Isabella Larocque, as she was cornered beneath the crystal chandelier of the Rosewood Conservatory, her voice laced with venom, and the flicker of something far more dangerous: ideology. "Others will take my place. Others already have. If you dig too deep, Duval, You may find your name added to the list. The threat hung in the perfumed air, chilling in its sincerity. But before another word could pass her lips, Inspector Gerard gave a subtle nod, and two silent officers, who had been positioned strategically near the exits the entire evening, moved in with the swift finality of executioner. Isabella resisted, but only for a moment. The mask of nobility she'd so expertly worn all these years cracked apart with each step they took toward her. What remained was the face of a fanatic, sharp with conviction, void of remorse. She spat words in a language only intelligence operatives might understand, invoking protocols, leverage, and continuity plans until she vanished behind the thick mahogany doors with her hands bound and her legacy splintered. The room, once humming with aristocratic gossip and clinking champagne flutes, collapsed into a paralyzing silence. No one could meet each other's eyes. What had seemed like idle dinner conversation and casual cultural discourse had in truth been carefully calibrated surveillance, a web spun by the very woman they had toasted just hours earlier. Lady Chalcott trembled, her teacup untouched, her gloves damp with sweat. Ambassador Lin wiped his brow with a handkerchief, embroidered with the insignia of a now discredited peace initiative. Each guest, in their own quiet horror, reeled at how easily evil had worn the guise of elegance, charm and credibility. Inspector Duval exhaled slowly, the long unraveling case having finally drawn blood from its last suspect. He lowered himself into a velvet armchair, his posture weary, the fatigue not of the body but of the soul. Outside, the night wind had shifted. The heavy perfume of the magnolia trees began to overtake the sharp sting of the poisoned hyacinth oil that had marked the murder weapon, the scent that had clung to Elise's throat as she sang her last note. Through the newly opened conservatory doors drifted the chorus of cicadas, as if nature itself had resumed its indifferent rhythm. Justice had been served, yes, but not without cost. Secrets had been stripped bare, alliances fractured, and trust decimated like shattered glass on the conservatory floor. And somewhere beyond the rolling hills, where shadows twisted along old courier roads, others were already stirring, reassembling what Isabella had built, maybe more carefully this time. Thank you for joining us for the poisoned aria at Rosewood Conservatory. Did you suspect the elusive Isabella before her chilling confession? Drop your theories in the comments. We're dying to know. If this tale of velvet shadows and whispered treason kept your little grey cells racing, be sure to subscribe for more daily mystery. Until then, remember Inspector Duval's words. It is not the knife nor the poison, but the conviction behind it that makes the killer dangerous. And the most dangerous conviction of all is the one disguised as virtue. This is Elodie, signing off from Midnight Whispers. Stories for the curious and the cursed.